I'll start over. Hello and welcome to our podcast, Kyra and I's podcast, where we're going to be talking with Ciel Haviland. We're very pleased to have her. She is a plant historian from Stanford University. And yay, we're going to launch right in with a couple of questions. This is going to be a podcast that's sort of surrounded by or focused on Ciel specifically. So this is really exciting. We're so happy to have her on board. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yay!
Excited. Do you want to start, Ciel, just giving us some background about you?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, again, thank you for this open chat, and like just in general, it's been lovely to connect and like just have an open discussion. I feel like the academic world that I'm in can feel really precise, and if you work outside of that precision, or if you're trying to expand beyond the precision, like nothing really happens. Or like communication doesn't really, there's like no there. So this is really fun. Yes, so I am a PhD student, aspiring to be a historian. I work in history of science primarily, but I am kind of by default, everybody has their own like default, but I'm working in North America before 1800, mostly France and England, though Europe, pretty interconnected, even in the early modern period. But my personal interest, my personal passion that brought me to all of this was plants. And I've worked with plants in a number of different ways. I've worked in policy, and I've worked in food and beverage, and I have been a floral designer for a really long time. And so many of those areas overlap in really interesting ways and diverge, of course. But I was not only wanting something that felt more sustainable in terms of like physically being able to maintain my existence and financially being able to maintain an existence, but then I was also feeling like I just had an intellectual hunger for more, and it felt like the best way to pursue that was through education. And so my whole like master's PhD career is basically just like me taking a break from farming. Like, I'm not clear that I won't go back to farming when this is over. There aren't that many academic jobs. It's really up to chance and serendipity. So how I use my degree is unclear. There are a number of ways I would love to use it, but yeah, so this is like my decade-long sabbatical from farming.
Wow, that's amazing.
So cool.
And so just to get a little, just to sort of understand even more your background and your interests and your expertise, how did you sort of like find yourself on your current path? Was it directly from farming?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of having well, I was definitely brought up with a like be well-rounded kind of ethos. And so I was trying to explore all of my interests all at the same time. And I just had too many interests. And so I have created a through line, but I have really taken the scenic route. I'm not a typical academic PhD student. I'm much older. I have much more like world experience. I have much more like different industry experience. And so I have really had to work very hard to understand the academic discipline itself. And I'm so sorry, but I hear someone knocking. They might actually have brought the water heater.
That's okay, don't worry about it.
And the hallway door, and then all the key over here, they're all over here right now. So
That's what I mean. I have that too, so, you know, they're like escape.
they'll probably be a little skittish of you, so. But I am on the call in the other part.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I moved a little bit, but please feel free to move anything else. Of course. Okay, I'm so sorry. He's here. I'll be able to take a shower tonight.
Yay! So that's actually a good transition, just talking about your path. I would love to know specifically more about your connection to history itself. What does history mean to you and its documentation? How has your understanding of history and history's like documentation shifted since returning to school?
Yeah. Well, I grew up really loving historical fiction and fantasy, and like I still do to a certain extent. That's not really always what I get to do with my time. But so I think from that lens, history was very personal. But there was also a certain amount of like concreteness, black and whiteness that I was taught and that is popularly reinforced about what history is. And I feel like my like professionalization has been to see that there's pretty much only nuance, and that I mean, and that's kind of hyperbolic, but there's so much nuance, and that there's so little that's black and white, and context and perspective are the actual history for me. I'm particularly interested in folk ideologies or indigenous ideologies. I think popularly we think of indigenous as Native American, especially in the US, but I mean that in terms of, and I think you've seen this a lot with the Voynich, indigenous just in terms of people who have been on the land for generations and generations and know it in that way. And so you can have, you know, indigenous French people, like the French were also colonized, and so were the English. And so there are just different layers of relationships with the land and the different like worlds that are created from those understandings. Of course, I got lost. Oh yes, documentation. I think so. A big debate that like first year of my PhD, we had to do a class that was like, what is history? And a big part of that is what is the archive, and this kind of deconstruction of a fetish almost of like what documentation is, who's allowed to see that documentation. And I think in the last like 30 years, it's broadly expanded to include things that weren't traditionally considered archive worthy, such as oral histories or even the way that these texts that we're both looking at are pictorial and understanding images as a certain kind of communication that's independent of like, it's not just like a how-to illustration. It has a whole world of knowledge in itself. And I think I've just, yeah. I mean, I don't think I have great systems. I'm perpetually trying to have better systems in terms of documentation. But yeah, like documenting my own process. But I think also what I've been learning is that there's just, you know, that insider baseball language. It's like you go through so many years of reading certain people and like you get to read their, you know, what they've been working on for the 30 years and how their thinking has changed. And so you're just able to take shortcuts that I think aren't available otherwise. So I'm getting to the point where I can take some shortcuts. I can be like, oh, okay, like Whig history, like what are you talking about? Like that is a history that thinks that goes towards it. The present is made of all of the, how do I say this better? In the past, all of the things that happened led to the present moment, and it is what it's supposed to be, instead of being like, there were so many paths that could have been taken, and maybe some people are still on those paths, and we just like can't even recognize that. But having multiple options, just like multiplicity in there in a way that wasn't in there before, as the baseline. For what I'm writing and how I'm approaching different archives.
That leads into our next question, which is your focus on Aztec codices. When did you transition into looking into Mexico and South America and different areas and regions in terms of codex?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of been an interesting like sub-theme in my history career. I learned Spanish in high school, and then I took a gap year learning Spanish. So, but then I was kind of like, I was like, oh, I'm not in love with Spanish. Like I really love French. And so it felt like not my emphasis. And coming to history and realizing that that was a skill that I could employ was really helpful. And it was also really interesting to recognize that if I'm looking at or looking for documents that are related to both European kind of world understanding, worldview, and a new world, so to speak, understanding. There are very few resources in the time period that I'm interested in, except for Mexico. So it's a little bit of practicality. I don't speak Nahua. That is the principal language that most of these documents are in. And I have done a thing that I don't recommend, where I work backwards from an interest. Which I think leads to a lot of like, just like blundering around, because I'm really interested in flowers. I think flowers are amazing. I'm really interested in aesthetics. I haven't really pursued that in my degree, but I hope to pursue that in the future. But looking at North American relationships with flowers and things of like sparkly wonder, there's like a defined world that's shaped like that. And I was in a class, let me remind myself what it was called. It was Religion in the Pre-Modern World, and it was mostly Europe focused. And I wanted to do some research on flowers in a kind of Native American context. And the best document that I found to represent that was the Cruz Badianis manuscript, which is part of this whole production of manuscripts right after contact, or farther after contact. It's like after conquest, and they've like established universities, and they're trying to kind of display the worth of Mexico. And part of that is just describing what's there. And so there are some codices like the Mendoza Codex, which describes like 300 years of pre-contact history. And then the Cruz Badianis manuscript is more of a like plant description. And so that's how I got there. I haven't really stayed there, but I am giving a lecture on it for the class that I am TAing in World History of Science. So my focus there has been a lot of talk about South American civilizations and what they were doing and what discoveries were made, and kind of emphasizing this cyclical discovery and forgetting that happens, especially in science. Like, I think it happens everywhere, but that's what I look at, so that's what I see. Yeah, so there's the cyclical, like, coming up with numbers, like coming up with a number 0 and creating whole worlds around health and religion, and like just kind of this dispersal in so many different ways and so many different levels. And I feel like this example was great for this class in particular, because it asks students to not only think about these two worlds coming together and what world it had been before, and also how it might or might not map onto the moment that we're in now.
Could you talk more about, I guess, how the style and language of the codices evolve with Spanish contact and conquest? Can you sort of see it as the time progresses in them? Totally.
Well, from my understanding, which, it's like, it's so hard because I feel like the Dunning-Kruger effect of like, I don't know anything. It's like, I do know a little bit about these, but I am no expert. But I am at the point where I can somewhat define what I don't know, which is an interesting point. So from what I understand, most paper documents were burned in part of this initial wave of conquest. And so there are some depictions of Nahua life and culture before contact, but these codices are specifically a imperial project, and they are looking to catalog all of the plants in the New World. So Mexico, I think, has like 2,000, 2,500 individual species of plants. And so it was seen as a huge space of opportunity. And there are a lot of things that came directly from that region that were kind of massive on a marketing scale, such as cochineal, which is grown on cacti. It's a parasite, but it creates a red dye, and that really transformed the trade industry. It's really hard to dye with natural materials, and this was one that created a great red. All of that to say that, so they were creating schools. They being Franciscan missionaries specifically, and those who I think mostly wanted to gain wealth. Spanish people who wanted to gain wealth, they might have had some sort of nobility, or maybe they were new to the nobility and like wanted to establish their importance in these ways. So there's like a lot of power dynamics going on. And they found a school and it's teaching Latin and Spanish. So the people who are going are often children of mixed race. Not that they had that, they didn't have our framework for that concept, but so it was like children mostly of Nahua mothers and Spanish fathers. And so they had two cultural contexts that they were already living in. And then when they were then doing this work of often copying or kind of like being overseen to create new information, such as, 400 most important plants of Mexico, which I kind of see as the codice, the Cruz Bandianas. And what's really interesting there is that the people doing it are clearly trying to adhere to a European norm, which is to say that they are doing certain pictorial descriptive things. Certain information is included, but then there are all over the manuscript indications that it's not originally a European view, that there's another view in there somewhere else. So it's like when you look at some of these paintings, the first thing that I would say is that some of these pigments can only be found there. And so that creates a certain specificity of color and need in terms of style. And then there are different world understandings in terms of what different elements do and what you need to know about a plant. So in a more European style herbarium kind of plant manual, regardless of what it's for, is often or is more and more going to depict the roots and different life periods, different moments of life of that plant. So it's going to depict the foliage, probably the flower, probably the seed. That's more standard by the time it comes to like my period of the early modern and like looking at it in like 1600s. They're pretty much all of the herbaria are doing that. But before that, it was like a little bit, some people were, some people weren't. Mm-hmm. And there's a more stylized notion of all of these plants. They're not looking as specifically. So this is also related to like a Greek or Roman understanding, philosophical understanding of origins of life. So like if there is an ideal out there that is the ultimate ideal and all of the things that we see on Earth are imperfect copies, then what they want to do is paint that perfect ideal instead of the imperfect copies. So they're purposefully being more stylized. And that practice changes over time, but in the 1550s, it's still very much part of the practice. So I would say that the codices are a hybrid. They're mostly European, but you see some of the indigenous Nahua work behind the curtain in different specific elements, like putting little shells at the roots of a plant, or indicating, or putting like an ant to indicate that this plant mostly grows in the hills, or indicating what kind of soil this plant grows in, because that would be important to not only how it grows, but probably how it's used. So there are little indications like that, but it is interesting that, yeah, if I had to categorize these, they would be European.
Yeah,
That is fascinating.
super fascinating. I mean,
also,
it's just, oh, sorry, what were you gonna
I was just going to say that, like, what's also so fascinating is that I was revisiting an article, actually I think it's a book, from Turner Janik, which you might recognize those names because they were writing about the Codex Cruz-Badianus because they were interested in the Voynich manuscript, because the iconography is so similar. The way that these plants are depicted is so similar.
Yeah, I was going to ask you the consolidation of time. So I write about magnification of the plants and also time collapse. So in the Voynich manuscript, it appears, what I've gathered is that several different life moments are pictured in one to consolidate and save space on the actual vellum. So like be like as economical with the vellum. Do you see that in the codices that you're looking at, where there's a consolidation of different time periods within one plant? Like, for example, there would be like the roots at full form, the bud, the flower, and the plant itself sort of combined.
Yeah, totally. I wouldn't say it's universal, but I think it's definitely there. And I think it's probably specific to what they see as needed, the required information for that plant. So I'm looking right now at some sort of cucurbit it's a very beautiful illustration, and you see the roots, the fruit, the flower, the leaves. But also what's interesting is that sometimes, well, the way it's written is like sometimes they get it wrong. Like sometimes they paint a leaf and it's smooth and it's supposed to be rough, and it's like, okay, but are they doing it wrong, or are we thinking that they're doing something that they're not?
Yeah.
Or there are combinations of leaves that wouldn't naturally occur, and the interpretation, at least from Tucker and Janik, is that is evidence that they were working from dried specimens, and probably that some of those specimens were erroneously put together. And I wonder, as somebody who's really interested in hybridization, maybe they're trying to describe something else, and are they trying to describe an effort at something new?
So one thing that I took note of in terms of my work on the Voynich, I talk about time collapse, magnification, and specifically like textural exaggeration. So if someone were touching it, those elements are specifically highlighted in the image. So like there are certain plants with really weird rough edges on the leaves, and those are like hyper exaggerated because when you touch it, like it's like that's how I've read a lot of the Voyniches, to be like specifically texturally exaggerated, as if, and there are also elements that allude to potential eye deficit or like vision deficit. So, those as being possibly correlated have come up. That has come up in the Voynich, and I wonder if that is similar in terms of texture with the codices that you're looking at potentially.
Well, I think it is interesting asking which sense we naturally rely on, and which sense these depictions are assuming. So, right now our society primarily relies on vision. And so I think that texture is important. It's so stylized to me that it does, it all has like a smoothness to it, but that's just my interpretation. But I think also that there are other elements like taste and smell and humidity that are very purposefully indicated, especially humidity. Like the aspect of water is, you know, really important. And so I think that there are other valences that are more important than our obsession with sight that are definitely represented. And I think also understandings of perspective are really coalescing at this time. And so if there's like a two-dimensional versus a first-person perspective, and that's seen in these codices, that kind of like a mishmashing, and I think it both kind of erases some of what's going on in one perspective versus another, but also is amplifying what they're able to. It just like expands their skill. So I think there's also like that moment of change that's happening, and understanding a different way to depict a personal relationship with something through this other context.
Definitely. I guess we can move on to some of Kyra's questions as well. This actually would transition well to the question about remedies, in terms of remedies that you've found in the Aztec codices. Have you found any similarities in terms of what we've presented with the Voynich? And then what does medicine look like in this time frame that you're looking at specifically in Mexico?
Really big questions.
I know.
Well, I think starting with the last question first, partially because it is such a broad question, and also because I am less comfortable with specifics because I haven't specifically studied these, and I don't study medicinal. I don't study like medical history of science. Right. So I know there are a lot of things that I don't have context for. But in terms of treating the body and treating the human, it's really fascinating that, you know, despite all of the accelerated change that's happening at this point, there's still so much reliance on Galenic and Hippocratic thought in terms of like how you treat the body and what that means for your health. There's a lot of the perspective is on the individual body and not on the illness. So it's not like an illness invades your body. It's like your body has an imbalance and you have to bring it into balance. And Galen did a lot of work to be very specific about what that is, like the bile and the blood.
Yeah, the core humors.
Yeah, the humors. And there is a kind of equivalence in Nahua medicine, from what I can tell, not being an expert, but it does seem like they're doing very similar things. Let me see if I can find it. There's this really fascinating passage. Yeah. Okay, that's not what I thought it was. Yeah, there are different ways of looking at the body and understanding the body that feel familiar to a European kind of understanding of the body in the same time and even after. Sorry, I'm still trying. It was such a good Okay, I'm sorry.
I'll take it.
Got caught by a quote that I, of course, cannot find. Yeah, there's an idea of, I wanted to be more specific. I'm just going to be a little bit general, but there's an idea of healing the body from top down. And so that's how they organize the plants. So it's like, if you have a headache, if your eyes hurt, if there's something wrong with your ears, your nose, etc. And so that's how they've organized the presentation of the plants. But also there's this really fascinating, it's like at tension with this idea that God creates a cure as he creates an illness, like that there is some sort of balance there in a Judeo-Christian formation of the world. There's this idea that you will find the cure where you find the ailment. And so there's this curiosity about trying to universalize these cures. So it's like, okay, if it's in the Nahua context, if you're in Mexico and you're using this plant because you have a fever, then sure, it works. But if you bring this plant out of Mexico, is it still going to work? And so there's a relationship with land that is very religious, but also very local.
That's awesome. I feel like there's a lot of similarities there in terms of like locality and universality. At least in like the research that has come up in terms of like different saints that have worked in medicine and also in the church. I'm thinking of the saint that was super into bees and pollination. There are aspects of that I think are coming up in the Voynich in terms of like Mediterranean climate. So Ireland hosts, like, especially in the Burn, like a wide variety of different climates. And it does seem like there are, at least in what I've translated, a transferring of plants and of seeds as a means of like medicinal trade exchange. So it's interesting to think about like the universality aspect of that in terms of like medicine and practice and exchanging plants across different climates that are generally the same. So in the Burn, there's Mediterranean climate. It can host Mediterranean plants that were likely or possibly brought over from different areas, Italy and Crete, etc. But yeah, it's fascinating to think about the locality versus the universality in terms of medicine.
I mean, it's also interesting to think, so if you're looking, so these texts are sometimes just like an ego project of some rich person who wants a fancy book on their shelves. And sometimes it's like a very practical manual. And sometimes those are the same. But if you're looking for a very practical kind of manual so that you can go pick things and know how to cure them so that they can be used, this stylized view of the plants that was very common can cover a lot of species and can obscure a lot of difference. And so what I've seen in my period is this like rapid expansion of species, but really a lot of theories are that it's just a being more specific and looking closer. So because people are going crossing oceans that they hadn't been able to cross before and are seeing such radically new things, there's an interest that was growing but wasn't kind of hadn't coalesced around identification and being super specific, it becomes more specific. And so there's this understanding of like an explosion of species that happens in Europe. And some of that is, yes, introduced, but some of that is also just different levels of noticing, new levels of noticing.
Same thing with birds too. Around the same period of time, there's like this explosion of differentiation between birds. There's this Flemish, I think he's Flemish guy that came up with a lot of the names for birds that have actually come up in translation just because they're related to plant names, actually.
Mm-hmm.
There's like an explosion of discovery, but it's really not discovery. It's just noticing, like you said. And it reminds me also, just to bring it back to something else you mentioned in terms of ailment being near the cure, that also exists in terms of like planting plants. I'm sure you know, where it's like something that can look like a mimic of something else nearby, well, like poison. So there we have that in the water hemlock root section. The water hemlock is like paired next to 2 or 3 other roots that look similar to it, just to differentiate. So I think that's really fascinating as well. And also just like to bring it back again to texture, there's something that's so like homey and not refined with the Voynich, that you see like in the actual vellum and materials itself. Like the vellum was like made like potentially homemade. Like they made that vellum. It was very like, that's why they were like economical, the scribes, or singular scribe potentially. But yeah, there's like this sort of like rustic quality to it, so to speak. But there's with the texture, it's interesting. There are 1 or 2 sections where it looks like there is some burning or like something that also corresponds to what is being translated. I'm thinking of the balsam toothache section, where it's like, sort of like a fiery pain is sort of like paired with something that looks like the pain itself, you know? So it's like very indicative. The actual like text in terms of what I'm translating is very indicative of what is visually being displayed as well, in case there are multiple ways of interpreting the text, or like experiencing the material. At the same, it seems like hyper specific, but at the same time really broad. If that makes sense in terms of like.
Yeah, well, what I'm hearing is like there's this parallelism, or like there's this like representing the same to cure some like representation of hot with something that feels hot,
right?
And then maybe invoking more of that, or using the opposite, which are very broad categories or just ways of relating.
Definitely. And then in terms of, we talked about Spanish influence, Kyra had a specific question about Tractatus de Deribus.
Oh, yeah, I guess just if you've looked at similar art and manuscripts or codices from the general time period in other areas of the world, and sort of how they align and differ.
Yeah, well, I've looked at a lot, not understood most. I don't speak Latin or Greek, and that's one of the big reasons that I'm in the early modern instead of an earlier period, because I wouldn't be able to understand those texts on my own. Even if, you know, like however imperfect translation may be, I wouldn't have the basic language down. And so I have seen a lot of different books, and you can tell that they're from so many different perspectives, so many different questions are being asked, they're answering so many different needs. And I mean, I'm also just interested in like the logistical, technical aspect of creating a book. So it's like you have a scribe tradition, like the process of making vellum is incredibly labor intensive. So it takes so long, and you need an enormous amount of resources to facilitate that. Whereas if you're using cloth or paper to make, or cloth or wood to make paper, it's a very different process, and you have different flexibilities. And if you're using a wood block, or if you're, hand painting something, or if you're using a later technology that's like more refined than a wood block. So I've seen a lot of other codices, and it's always interesting to see what's emphasized. One of my first archival crushes was this book. I think it was like maybe around 1500. It was a herbaria on Canadian plants that was authored by a man who had never been to Canada. And so there's just this like, and that's pretty common. It's like there's this fascinating world of mostly, Europeans describing the native flora of a different location, and doing that through descriptions and specimens that survive whatever travel, and not usually alive matter. But when I wrote my thesis on a British woman in India, or an English woman in India before I was Britain. And she was there in 1801 to 1807, and she was doing botanical work. And all of those sources were very interesting. And I really got into the context of the Indian school of painting and the English school of painting. And I think that they're looking at works like that, you really see a similar parallel where even in imitation, there are traditions that come through. Like if you have, like most of the floral botanical paintings in Kew Gardens, like archive, that are from India, from that period, they're all being painted by Indian painters. And they had, they were like working for the Mughal emperors, and then they just kind of like switched to the other people who would pay. And they tried to translate into the style, or they tried to switch into the style that was being asked of them, but there are still old kind of patterns that shine through.
Right.
And I think that looking at moments of interaction like that are really helpful. And I think that they can say so many things, but my personal inclination is to like kind of let it speak for itself, which as a historian is like not a great inclination. I'm supposed to be like more incisive than that. But I think that, to a certain extent, just noticing their differences and their similarities does a lot of the work, the intellectual work around it.
So you just talked about distance and like the separation of actually fully engaging the land and the plants at hand, and that distance. It brings up something that has come up recently in terms of our research. One of our friends and patrons who has been following along for a long time, Nick, pointed us in the direction of this amazing podcast, which I recently posted about on my Substack. And this Irish, I think he's a historian, is talking about different manuscripts from our general time period, 1400s, 1500s, and the idea of like oral tradition and writing from oral instruction. How has that come up in your own research, in your own deep dives, in terms of actually writing things that are based off of auditory instruction, as opposed to like, not having that distance, so to speak?
Well, that's really interesting. My research right now is more focused on like 1690s to 1750s. And that period is like a really interesting moment in the idea of botany and science. And what I'm looking at there is basically understandings of plants, but I'm really interested in like a vernacular versus a dominant understanding of plants, and looking at different ways to access that. And so I feel like my context for that question is quite different. It's still really fascinating, but it is quite different and highlights very different things than I think you're seeing at this time, because I think you can still take some of the same considerations, but it's like the world, I don't know exactly what the world looked like, but something that comes up over and over again is the division between men and women's worlds, in terms of women's worlds being saturated with knowledge that isn't accessible to men, or and men being the people who write things down and like create this kind of canon, or there being secret practices that you just wouldn't write down because that would be against the whole practice in and of itself. So I think those aspects probably feature more in the Voynich time period. I don't know if it features more in the Voynich specifically, but I think oftentimes reading something is just reading the absences when we're looking at these historical documents. And maybe it's an aberration. Maybe it's a woman who wrote the whole thing, who has studied her whole life and comes from a tradition of people who know about plants or other amazing things. But usually it's a monk who has been trained in a very specific way, because writing is a very specific communication technique that's not actually that useful at that time. And so the knowledge that gets funneled through that medium is so narrow. Even though it seems like Voynich just has all of these incredible worlds represented, and it seems so vast.
It seems like the words are like floodgates. They're just like, the one word can represent so many different like visual understanding of, it's just kind of like a floodgate. When I include all of the homonyms and everything, like the way that I've been translating, it's really just like, so it seems so comprehensive for so like actual physical text.
I like walled myself into my little corner with so many books, because there are so many books that I have been thinking about in relationship to this conversation. But one of them is this book, and I'm so...
I saw your TikTok on this. I want to read this. Ooh.
I'm so curious if you ever connected with him, what he would have to say about this project, because
I'll CC him in this.
He talks so much about the various different meanings of words, and also the generations of meanings of words, especially in terms of various breaks in time for Ireland. It just has so many iterations of conquest. And so those different time periods really, one word that might mean the hill, like that can have so many different meanings,
Right.
and its current day usage can also mean so many different things.
Yeah, there seems to be some level of discretion, like a
Yeah.
layer of discretion purposely placed upon certain sections that I've been translating, which is very delicate in and of itself. I'm sometimes like hesitant to post things because I know that it's like delicate, but I also think being not a native Irish speaker actually lends itself to translating this, because my mind is not like formed or set to certain
Yeah.
connotations or word specificity. So being sort of new to the language, me learning Irish through this translation is actually lending itself to the translation even more than I thought it would, which is kind of like surprising. I don't know if I told you, but I did someone demonstrated repeatability who's a native Irish speaker, and his first pass at some of the lines were like religious leaning, which I thought was really fascinating. But it was very much because of his upbringing and worldview and understanding of the language that leaned it slightly more religious leaning, which I thought was really fascinating.
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is like, oh, what do you even mean by that? Like, is it religious in terms of like Judeo-Christian religious, or is it religious in terms of like spiritual, or like
the word prayer, or where it was something else in my translation that was like more specific and more literal and tactile rather than prayer. I can't remember exactly what the word was, but I guess I mean like Christian leaning in terms of Christ and prayer both came up in his translation that weren't there in mine.
Yeah. Well, it's also so interesting, like, okay, at the time
this goes back to the idea of also women and men's knowledge also being slightly different as well in terms of
or like homonyms, even just like what's the difference between worship or relating to something and praying to it. I was like, I know I have so many things from this book that I blew my mind, but one of them goes back to the question of oral tradition versus written tradition. And in a chapter called Dancing Words, and 32 Words for Field, he says,
there are around 20 words for green, by the way, in Irish, which is so great. I was like counting them the other day. I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many greens.
That makes so much sense.
There's so many different types of rain too. There's this really great TikTok Irish instructor that talks about the different words for rain. There are a lot of different kinds of rain.
Yeah.
Great.
And it's not a compound language, right? It's not like they're like individual, unique words. They're not just like Germans smushing a bunch of different terms together.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Irish is layered on top of itself in the strangest, most incredible way, where a lot of bodily things are also nature related oriented things. So there's like a layering there that is really interesting in terms of translation, just because you have a sort of a stack of layers sometimes with one line where it seems like it could be talking about wood and layering, and it also could be talking about bodily things.
Well, one of the I haven't finished this, but one of the things that I think it's Manchon, not sure how to say his name, he talks about how the colonial influence and the like the specifically Judeo-Christian colonial influence has meant that he's like, I might not get it because I'm a guy, but also it seems like most of the preserved knowledge is not about women. So it's like terms for anatomy, women's anatomy are just, there aren't that many. And it's known that that people used to have like
alternative words too.
Yeah, body humor, but they don't
Yeah.
have any of those like bad words anymore because
Right.
they weren't preserved because they weren't seen as something to preserve.
It's interesting. Etymologically, though, I'll see these words come up that later on mean the dirty thing that they originally meant like 100 years prior. Do you know what I mean? Like the word vulva came up in something that I was translating, and it didn't mean vulva until like 150 years after the time period that I'm looking at. But I'm like, this is clearly what is being.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to quickly, I think you'll love this. So, in terms of the meaning of language and also just like the sound of language and sound being meaning, but also relating or like an oral tradition to the very land that you're talking about. One stormy Christmas, I spent a weekend in an old lighthouse worker's cottage in County Donegal and watched as the air pressure from the Atlantic waves pummeling the seawall sent the tea in my cup spilling over. By singing a soothing lullaby to the tea, I was able to calm it again, easing the surface tension perhaps. I got my friend to try singing to her cup and the effect was different. Not only does each language have its own frequency, but so too do individual speakers. The sound waves of our words have a frequency related to the frequency patterns of our vocal folds. So my speaking Irish will have a different effect from the same words spoken by someone raised entirely in that frequency.
I love that.
Yeah, he's saying the frequency of Irish is lower than that of English. So there's like a different, yeah, they're literally on a different wavelength.
Honestly, like I don't believe in magic, but Irish as a language, some kind of mysterious, magical, I don't even know. It is so incredible. This has been like the beginning of such a long journey. I can already tell in terms of Irish. I'm so glad that it's having like this renaissance right now. Sort of, not just in Ireland, but also here in America. I think that Irish people are resonating a lot with what we're dealing with here. So it's really incredible to see the language take new shape. One of the people that demonstrated repeatability is building a couple of different Irish learning apps, like software learning. So we have a lot of overlap there. I'll hopefully be able to promote that once it's further along, but it's just really fascinating to see Irish sort of, like stick further the roots in the ground because the roots are already there. You know what I mean? The roots are so far there in the soil, and cementing even further the Irish language.
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, you've received so much pushback and there's like so much emotionality around this manuscript, and I am curious. So I'm doing my oral exam soon, and so I'm having like weekly, bi-weekly meetings with the advisors overseeing certain lists. And I was talking to my environmental history professor, and she kept pressing on like these very transformational ideas of the colonial exchange and like the Columbian exchange and the imperial experience of nature or effect on nature, and all of these ideas that we've built up around it, and like what if all of those ideas are wrong, like what remains in the end. And I think that's a really interesting kind of parallel question to the work that you're doing in terms of like there's a whole concept of legitimacy, and that's its own kettle of fish or whatever the expression is. Yet I think also it's like what is being learned here, that no matter how it might relate to the original,
right,
it's still valuable.
Yeah, I don't know, Kyra, do you want to? I feel like I've been talking a lot.
Oh, I mean, on my end of things, I'm mostly just taking her translation and trying to situate it contextually and make sense of it that way. And I mean, to me, once she started getting like location names, that's when I felt pretty comfortable jumping in and getting involved. But if you go on other like Voynich centric websites or forums or anything, you see a lot of people that, based on like visual only, there are a lot of assumptions made that to disregard any of those assumptions that are considered like foundational aspects of the research, to ignore those or to challenge them, you're immediately written off.
Mm-hmm.
I am not surprised by, really, in any academic context, but it's definitely very rampant with the
Yeah.
In the linguistic side of things, it is such a narrow science at this point in terms of linguistics, in terms of where LLMs are at, which like there's no AI in any of the work that I do. I am terrified of AI and where it's going. And right now, in terms of linguistics, it's so married and coupled with LLMs and where technology is, especially in terms of like the narrowness and the specificity of the field itself. It makes it almost impossible for a regular person to join a conversation on the Voice forum, for example, where it is just like the jargon that's used. It takes me so long to even read and comprehend sometimes what people are saying on the forum, because it's abstract at this point. And that's one of the reasons why I keep all of my work completely accessible on GitHub and on Substack, where you can see every single search that I'm doing on Penguin. So anyone can literally pick up and try to do this themselves using my lexicon and my methods. So it's as accessible as possible, especially for Irish speakers to join in, because I very well could be wrong with certain words where I'm like hearing and seeing something like the D and the G have overlap, for example, and the S and the C, they have overlap visually. So there are aspects where it's like I'll include multiple words where an Irish person can be like, oh no, that's definitely this one. You know what I mean? Like they can add specificity and jump in and add. So there's just like so much room for collaboration and overlap and continuation and expansion of like understanding of the actual text and material itself. And when you go on some of these forums, it seems like it's like the exact opposite. It's really limiting and narrowing and exclusionary to some degree. But yeah, I guess. And the visual component, just to bring it back to what Kyra said, in terms of like medicinal aspect and what's actually being described in the text, it is important to have those plant identifications accurate. In my mind, I'm like, no, this is not like the viola tricolor when you call it the viola tricolor. It's so important to like call something for what it is when it's talking about like medicinal purposes, medical texts. This also goes back to the idea of, marketing the Voynich to kids is not necessarily the most responsible thing to do.
Yeah, like I understand kids love mysteries, but the actual content might not lend itself towards that demographic.
Exactly. Little Einstein, little doctors. Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, for myself, I don't think I have I'm still contemplating, like, what does it mean if some of the foundations of my understanding of these periods of history are just incorrect, or if like the kaleidoscope that I'm using as my lens to understand these things actually has a huge blind spot. Like I think one of my answers was like, I think we just have to be humble, because we're trying to do something that isn't necessarily, like, sometimes things want to be decoded and sometimes they don't. And sometimes society wants a thing to be decoded and sometimes it doesn't. And so, that was my initial reaction, but also I'm just like I'm just still mulling this thought over of like, what is the utility of the work I'm doing if I'm wrong? And
the intention, maybe not utility, but the intention. Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, I think like the value is in the intention. The value is like in the curiosity and in the collaborations that happen. So, anyway, I don't know.
No, it's so true. I feel like I would never have met you both.
No.
This is just like, I'm always just like so giddy. I was telling Kyra before we jumped on the call, I was like, my cheeks are gonna hurt because I'm cheesing so hard. I'm just so happy that we were able to hop on this call and just like collaborate in general. I think it's really like fascinating that the algorithm, for whatever it's worth,
yeah. No, it's so exciting and it's so fun having conversations like this. Yeah, and I feel like we've like framed this as like outside the academy, and I have lots of thoughts about the academy that like don't need to be expressed here and now, but it's like I think that we do need a space where knowledge is not used as currency necessarily or commodity, but as something else. And I think figuring out that something else is so exciting and fun.
Yeah,
Definitely.
totally.
That's a good way of putting it.
Well, I don't know what you guys have to do, but I have to go read some books.
Yeah.
Read some books.
To go make some dinner.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
With my cat, who's very patiently waiting for me.
Well, thank you both so much. If there's anything that needs to be re-recorded, just let me know.
I think this is perfect. And then also, if you ever want to hop on a call for specific plants ever, I can send you a bundle. I can send you a bouquet.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I'm hoping to get more into, or I'm seeing if I get more into, is what I'm calling sensitive plants. And so plants that are reactive in a way that wasn't part of like the philosophical concept of plants for so long. So this is like different peas, like a sweet pea or as a flower, or just like legumes, they climb and they are very reactive. And some of the plants that are known as very sensitive in the time period that I study were from abroad. And there's also just like an intellectual shift in terms of what people are kind of allowing to theorize about. So like the idea of a sensitive plant doesn't really have a context before this period. But yeah, like I think, plants like that move on their own. I would love to look at those.
Cool. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, climbing plants have come up a couple of times. There's like specific words that are used in terms of like ivy and climbing plants and flowers. Like, what is it? Little bell is a climbing ivy that comes up. Yeah. I can find some maybe to see how they're described. Maybe they're described similarly.
Yeah. No, that would be fascinating because I'm sorry, I said I would go and then I'm not. But I just wonder if there's like there's such an intellectualization of the plant field, and I think that there's also an experiential relationship that I experience, and therefore I wonder how many other people experience as being much more animate, and however that might translate into different world conceptions, if it's like they are actually animate, or if it's just like they have more capacity than Aristotle says they do.
Well, it's interesting that you use the word animate because I don't know if you've seen like the root section in the Voynich, like they're posing. The little roots are like animate and posing, and very, very. There will occasionally be a word that will like overlap with like a descriptor or an adjective that is like looks like the plant itself. Like very like very animated, or what is it? Anthropomorphized.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also in terms of root trajectory of roots, like will be animated in the Voynich. Like
Yeah.
there are like types of yew trees that will grow, the roots will grow upwards, and if they're waterlogged, and that's like depicted in one of them where you see the roots like kind of like reaching upwards instead of down. Like,
yeah.
Things like
Well,
that.
there are a lot of interesting like experiments that I was reading about in the early 1700s, where they were just trying to understand more about boundaries of growth. And so they were doing all these crazy things with trees, like cutting them in half and burying half of it and seeing if it would regrow. And they would like make these kind of, they would top trees, but instead of doing it by cutting it off, they would just plant it underground, and then you would see new growth. It was wild.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay. Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming on our podcast.
Yeah. Let me know when I can listen to it.
Yeah, I'll post it probably later today. I'll just cut the beginning part of it where I screw up. Yay!
Yay. Okay. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was so fun.
Yay! Oops. Let me see if I can stop recording. Oops. There we go. Stop.